Good evening and welcome to our fourth musical conversation of our Chamber Music Northwest 2021-22 season. Our wonderful and entertaining and incredibly inspiring guest tonight is composer Joan Tower. Each of these musical conversations precedes our Saturday night premieres of the programs that we're presenting this season. And this Saturday evening on January 30th, we will have a recital for cello and piano by Elisa Weilerstein and Inon Barnatan, playing works by Manuel de Falla and Sergei Rachmaninoff. A really, really beautiful performance that I hope that you will tune into. Originally, Elisa was to perform a solo cello program, works by Bach and Golihov and Britten. We were very happy to find out that she would be able to do a cello and piano program. But meantime, we had invited Joan to talk about solo instrumental writing, and it's just an opportunity that's too good to pass up to ever have a conversation with Joan. So looking ahead to other solo programs in future seasons, we thought it would still be wonderful for Joan to talk about solo writing versus writing for ensembles, for larger groups. It's a very special idiom, and Joan really is one of the best. I've enjoyed listening to her works. I've enjoyed playing her works. And Joan, are you there? You need to join us with your video and your audio. There you are.
Hi.
It's nice to
Hello.
see you,
Hello.
Joan. Joan, where are you right now?
I'm in New York, in the Hudson Valley, Red Hook, New York.
And it looks like you are in your studio. Is that right?
I am with lots of light so that I'm not in the dark.
Now, are we getting a sneak peek of a piece back there on the piano? Can I
Oh,
see?
yeah, that's my new cello concerto for La Lisa.
Oh my gosh, you were
Yeah,
telling
yeah,
me about this.
yeah.
So just, I mean, for our audience, this was just a pure coincidence. I only found this out last week, that Joan is in the middle still, right, of writing a
No,
new cello
I am
concerto.
almost finished. Almost finished. Yeah.
Oh, for Lisa Weilerson. It'll be performed next season,
Hopefully, we'll see.
hopefully.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm sure we'll get there. But it's with a number of orchestras, I think you mentioned.
Mhm. Right. Three
Um,
orchestras.
okay. Well, can you tell us you had an unusual week last week? I mean, we all had an unusual week last week, but for you, musically, it was unusual. Can you tell us? Maybe some of
Oh,
our audience actually got to hear your work, but can you tell us what was done and how you were
well,
informed?
I got to participate in the inauguration as a composer, which was an amazing, amazing invitation. Um, I have these fanfares called Fanfare for the Uncommon Woman, and there are six of them. And the first one was played at the inauguration alongside of Copeland's Fanfare for the Common Man. And that fanfare was for Joe Biden, and mine was for Kamala Harris. And they did a whole video with it. It's classical movements. You can find it on YouTube. It's an amazing video, and I was very touched to be able to be a part of that whole thing.
I mean, did you ever imagine when it was written? When was the piece written?
Ay, ay, ay. Okay.
Okay,
I'm terrible with dates.
that's
I
okay.
think it's
That's okay.
around in the 80s, I think. It was my first, it's for brass and percussion, the same as Copeland's. And it's often played with Copeland's fanfare. I'm honored to say because I'm a great admirer of Copeland's. In
And
fact, I was influenced by him. So there are six of them.
at the time, was it written for a
Yes, it was
particular
written for the
individual?
Houston Symphony. Uh, uh, Tobias Picker was the composer in residence, and he had this great idea of commissioning composers to write fanfares for every concert, every subscription concert. He wanted to make composers really felt as on the series, and it was a great idea. So he asked us all to write a fanfare. So I thought, what's a fanfare? All I could think of was trumpets, you know. And then I
Sure.
thought of Copland's fanfare, and I said, you know what? I want to do a tribute to Copland, but I also want to do a tribute to women. So it's designed, the title is for women who are visionary and take risks and who are adventurous. And the dedicatees are all that type. The first one was Marin Alsop, who's a pioneer, a woman conductor, and she's the one who conducts in the video also.
So, I mean, did you ever imagine that it would be a part of history, like this, like last week?
Oh no, I was just trying to figure out how high the trumpet went and things like that, you know. I had no idea. Yeah.
And you know what's amazing is I'll bet we would hear a very similar response from a lot of composers throughout history, right? That they had no idea what kind of life their various works would take. I'm going to I'm going to ask you later on a little bit about your other works as well. Um, but can you tell us just a little bit, very quickly, about your background? I mean, how you began music? Was it on a particular instrument? How old you were?
Well, I grew up. I started out in Westchester, and I had a piano teacher who was fantastic, and I took to it right away at a very early age. And then my father got a job in Bolivia in South America, so we moved there for 9 years. So I actually grew up after nine in South America, which was an incredibly eye-opening experience for me because it showed me a different culture, a different language, a different everything, and it turned out to be have a major impact on me, on my life, and on my music. So there, I studied piano, and we moved around. I was sent to school in Santiago because I was a little bit of a rebel, and my father thought I needed some discipline. And I managed to break a lot of the rules at that school. And then we moved to Lima, Peru, and I moved back to the United States and went to school. And uh, eventually, I went to Bennington College, which is in Vermont. And that was a great place for me because it was for rebels. I was pretty much of a rebel, as I said. And um, they asked me to compose a piece there. It was the first time. I had just been playing piano up to that point. And I wrote a piece and it was a disaster. I mean, I was like so embarrassed. I was like, I can do better than that. I know I can do better. So I spent the next 60 years trying to do better. and I continued playing the piano when I moved to New York. I went to Columbia University and I started my own group, the Capo Chamber Players, and we played a lot of new music mostly. And it was a great that was a great education for me to become a real active player and to deal with composers from the player side. And then I composed. They got better and better, and I got worse and worse because I was becoming more and more played as a composer, and I wasn't practicing enough. So I had to leave the group, but I was there for 5 years, and I really had the best education
Okay,
that I
Joan.
had.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there something with your microphone? Do you happen to be touching it or moving it? No.
Oh, sorry.
Is
I,
it possible?
can you hear it now?
No, it's good. All
Oh,
good
I
now.
was I was doing this. Sorry,
You were
I'm
playing the piano.
very physical. Yeah.
Well, which we'll also get into later. I mean,
Okay. Yeah.
it's so for the our audience members who are not familiar with Joan's work. I mean, hopefully you heard some of it just before this, as you were in the waiting room. But her music is all of these things she's talking about: rebellious, adventurous. and very physical. Lot of motion. It's so wonderful for me to. I'm looking at one of her scores here on my desk, and just seeing all of these traits there in the black notes there. So, just a really quick, because I love to tell this story about how we met. And this, as with a lot of good stories, is probably gotten twisted along the way somewhere. But it's a wonderful moment in my memory. We were, you had a piece being performed with Nashville Symphony a number of years ago, and I was playing a Mozart concerto on that program. And I don't know do you remember this, Joan? Yeah. That's actually
No, no,
it
I
was
don't
it was
remember this.
it was in the first season of the beautiful new hall in Nashville. I think it
The
was called the
Schermerhorn Hall.
Yes, right, right.
That's not so long. I opened that hall.
It was well, yeah. I was there right around that time, and
Oh,
so
okay.
so this is what in my memory. Joan and I were having coffee after one of the first concerts, and so I'd heard her work, and she'd listened to my Mozart, and she said to me, I really think you're a very interesting musician, and you play so well. And do you like Mozart?
Now you're embarrassing me now.
No, but it was, for me as a younger violinist, it was actually a very important moment in
Really?
my life in terms of my relationship with composers, just how I looked at compositions. To not just what you said about Mozart, but what you said about many pieces of music and composers subsequently, and for us that first of all, that it's okay that for us to think that Mozart is not the be all end all. He and also to see how it just doesn't different composers' music doesn't necessarily connect with people. And I could, as I got to know more of your music, I could see. I think at one point I said, "Not Mozart, Beethoven," and and I think
Exactly.
you
And
right
Haydn
there,
too.
right?
Haydn too. Yeah.
And Haydn, right? Um, but I mean, what if you can? So let's start right there. Why not Mozart? Why Beethoven? What are the qualities, the traits?
Well, I think the big difference between Beethoven and well, I should be careful here.
They're not
Beethoven.
here. They're not listening.
Oh yeah, he's right behind me. See, he's right on the wall there. I try to take him off the wall, but I just can't take him off the wall. Uh, no, I think I played both of these composers. I played a lot of dead white European male composers when I was growing up, and I loved them, and I particularly loved Beethoven because of the narrative of what he does, how he creates this incredibly dynamic narrative by juxtaposing things and also taking a lot of risks as he's going along in this gigantic architecture, which keeps getting more and more interesting as time goes on. I learned a tremendous amount from that unconsciously, and probably used a lot of his juxtapositions and his risk taking in some unconscious way. But my music doesn't sound like Beethoven, but the narrative is similar. Mozart to me was always a little too perfect and too like when I played Mozart, I was so afraid of making a mistake. It was like walking on eggs. You know, I did not feel comfortable with that at all. I preferred Haydn, who's very close to Mozart, because there's a kind of a range of risk in Haydn that I relate to more than in Mozart.
So, having said that, and looking forward in music history from Beethoven, would you say that the composers whom you connect most with were they also kind of groundbreakers, a little bit like Beethoven was? Like they were new because that was a big part. Like you said, risk takers, right? Not just existing and using what was around them and what was given to them.
I don't think necessarily groundbreaking, because there can be some very traditional composers who are take risks. Um, I mean, I'm really beginning to like Bach a lot. I didn't like Bach before. Now I'm getting much more into Bach because the material is so um, well made, and he doesn't take a lot of risks in terms of register or in terms of dynamics or in terms of, but it's so well made that you're just like living in this castle. Um, it's taken me a long time to get to Bach, but Tchaikovsky is one of my favorite people too, because there's this huge dramatic um, landscape that he manages to maintain as dramatic over extended periods of time. And that to me is amazing what he pulls off. Uh, so I'm not sure it's whether they're groundbreaking or not. I don't didn't like Schoenberg very much, and he's groundbreaking. Um, I think it's more, what is the music doing contextually? How does it operate within itself?
Is part of that structure what we have come to call structure in music? What you're talking
Well,
about?
that's a very complicated word.
Hmm.
Structure is very, because the narrative is so different with so many composers.
Hmm.
I mean, Bach has one narrative, Beethoven has another, Tchaikovsky has another, Stravinsky has another. Uh, Then they all have very different structures, So I think what makes them so great, though, is that they get into inside that structure and that voice. Like if you play one measure of Bach, you know it's Bach,
Hmm.
or one measure of Chopin, you know it's Chopin, because the voice is so clear and so deep right away, right away. But the narrative, of course, is incredibly important too. How do they get a piece to stay together?
Hmm. And I mean, also for those of our audience members who don't know Joan's music well, um, those who have heard it in the concert hall and especially multiple pieces, I think will vouch for this. That there is, I would describe it as, I guess, a little bit of a structure, pacing. That there's just tremendous, just amazing pacing,
Thank you.
and often just riveting. Just like on the edge of your seat, and just the something about the proportions and how you develop it, and relax and develop it in the end.
That's
I
an
don't.
amazing compliment. Thank you. Because that's what I work hardest at, is getting the pacing right, which is the hardest thing. Thank you for that, saying
Well,
that.
it's
That's a huge compliment for me. Thank you.
it really is. It's the of so many elements that I admire about Joan's music. That's really something that I'm struck by. No matter what the instrumentation or the length of the piece, and yeah, and ultimately, I think that I have heard a lot of composers talk about how much they value that, and it's not something that it's not the first thing that we instrumentalists always think of. We tend to get all tied up in the details, right? The execution of all the little things, and I mean, to also to flatter you, I mean, we every phrase, every gesture, we want to make it really something
You don't
something
have to worry
great.
about the rest of it. You just do it with the details, of course. We have to worry about
Yeah,
that.
but there is it's so interesting when you've played a piece a lot and you've never heard it from the outside, and sometimes how different an experience that can be.
That
And
is true. I just had my 80th birthday celebration, and there's this clarinetist. Uh, He's principal of New York Phil. Actually, his name is Anthony McGill. He's a fantastic clarinet player. He played my Wings, which I think we're going to talk about.
Hmm.
He said he taught this piece for years, but he had never played it. And he said it's very different playing it than
Hmm.
teaching it.
And did he say how, or did he say which he
Yeah,
preferred?
he said he didn't realize how physical it was and how detailed and demanding it was physically to get through it. It is an Olympic ski course, that piece.
Yeah. Well, we'll listen to a little bit of it. I know Joan told me before, as we were talking, she hates excerpts. Here we are talking about pacing and structure and arc, and now we're going to dissect her music a bit. It's horrible. Um, but for the sake of time and talking about a few different things, it's wonderful to get a taste of um, different things. But so, can you tell our audience a little bit the experience? How is it different writing for orchestra as opposed to a chamber ensemble, as opposed to a solo instrument?
Well, I didn't finish my biography there, but just to catch up a little on that, I was launched into the orchestra world when I became composer in resident with St. Louis with under Leonard Slatkin, and that changed my life dramatically because I started to travel around the orchestra world, and I was there for 3 years, and then I was with Orchestra St. Luke's for 10 years, and then I was with the Pittsburgh Symphony and the Albany Symphony. So I've been around the orchestra world quite a bit and gotten to know it pretty well, living with all these orchestras. But I also grew up as a chamber player, and that was my first thing. I was never a soloist. I couldn't. I didn't have the talent for that. I loved chamber music, and I still love chamber music. I mean, I've written six string quartets and 11 quintets, and I mean a lot trios. Um, though all these worlds are extraordinarily different, and they treat composers very differently. You see, living composers walk into these situations, and they're a litmus test as to how they're going to get viewed. It's a litmus test for me, how I'm going to be viewed, how my music is as a living composer. Some of these places are very resistant to living composers, like, oh no, this is too risky. Don't no no don't do this. No 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 no. You'll lose the audience. Kind of thinking. I got that in spades in the orchestra world. And living with the orchestras, I saw how that worked, and the marketing and the figure and the so the orchestra world is very tough on us living composers, very tough. It's changed a little bit in the last 10 years, but it's still 90% dead composers. I use that I use that word jokingly, dead. They're actually very live, strong composers, but they just happen to be dead. Um, but I love the chamber music world because there's time. It can take a piece can take time. You can change things, and you can work with the players, and they can make suggestions, and you can have like a cooperative creative experience. Whereas with the orchestra, you walk in, and if you're allowed to say 3 words, you're lucky. It's not an inviting situation because the time element is very short. And if your piece isn't on the page perfectly, there's not room for change except after it's over. Then you can change. So it's a very different world, the orchestra world. Um, so my love is chamber music. It really is chamber music, especially string quartets.
How about in the process of writing, though? How different is that experience, or not very? While you're actually thinking, imagining, and you know, putting this down, and just an orchestra score is just bigger. Right?
Well, there's a lot of work. making an orchestra score. This cello concerto I just finished is 122 pages long. That's a lot of work. It's a lot of proofreading. It's a lot of editing. It's a lot of keeping track of, do I want one flute or two flutes, and what's the percussion going to sound like with this group. It's a lot more challenging in that sense, mechanically speaking. I love writing solo pieces. I've written a number of solo pieces now, and it's because it's almost pure. You're dealing with a kind of a pure line. You don't have timbre changes unless well, the instrument itself, but you can't go into another timbre, uh, and you have a limited registral, uh, well, especially with the oboe or the trumpet, you have very limited space to go to work. I had to write a piece for four trumpets once. I felt like I was in prison because the space was so limited. I had to squeeze them into this space. Whereas the violin has a huge range, like the flute does, cello somewhat, not as much, but yeah. But I love writing for solo because I have more control over the action of the piece.
No, something I've heard some composers talk about is, and we touched upon this earlier, is that um, they fear writing solo music a little bit more because it's more feel more naked. Maybe you just fewer
Exposed,
sounds to
exactly.
play with, but you don't feel that at all.
Oh, I do, but I like the intimacy of it, the control over it. I feel I have more control over it, so that doesn't bother me as writing for like a uh, orchestra. Orchestra's a lot to deal with.
Hmm. So then let's go to the solo instruments, and definitely something you talked about is the difference between instruments like the piano and the guitar, which are harmonizing themselves, right, playing multiple voices, versus what we'll get to, clarinet and violin. But I mean, are those still considered solo instruments, therefore, or this is like a
No,
different
no,
category?
not really. I think of the piano as an orchestral instrument, actually. Has a huge range, probably the largest range of any instrument, and it does everything. You can do harmonies, you can do melodies, accompaniments, you can do motive development. I mean, you can do everything with the piano. The piano to me is an orchestral instrument. Um, and the guitar, not as much because it's more limited in terms of range of dynamics and range of it's a smaller range of everything. The guitar, very difficult to write for too. Oh my god. Well, can I tell my story?
Of course, don't tell many stories.
This has to do with what we were talking about, whether a piece is idiomatic or not for an
Ah,
instrument.
yeah.
So Sharon Isbin, who's a wonderful guitarist, asked me to write a solo guitar piece. So I wrote this piece kicking and screaming. It was so hard. It's because the guitar is unlike any other instrument. It's just very different physically and technically. So I wrote it, and it was chosen to be played at the International Guitar something festival, and it was a required piece for the semi-finalists. So I got to hear 16 guitarists from around the world, all really top-notch guitarists, play this piece. I was so nervous because I was not totally sold on my own piece. And here were these fantastic players, one after another. This French guy comes up to me and he says, Jean, I have some good news and some bad news about your piece. I said, okay, give me the bad news first. And he goes, it's not very idiomatic for the guitar. But I like the piece, so I'm going to play it. And that was a huge compliment because he liked the piece in spite of the fact that it wasn't particularly idiomatic for the guitar.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's true of we've talked about this. It's true of history. Beethoven wrote some incredibly uncomfortable music, and so did Brahms for the instrument. But because the music is so powerful, it's being played because the music outrides the the idiomaticness of the music
That's
outweighs.
it's such a fascinating issue. And our audience should also know that Joan is one of the great composer educators of today. I mean, for many years, and she's just one of the most treasured teachers for young composers. And I'm sure you must have a lot of advice regarding this issue. If I know from a performer standpoint, if a piece is too awkward, I mean, what we might consider unplayable versus incredibly difficult, but then there's kind of a little bit unplayable. I mean, I do also, sometimes I roll my eyes at performers who say that upon sight reading it because I say, well, I mean, come on,
Give it a chance.
yeah,
Yeah,
we spent
yeah,
years working on some older music, and we just, a Bach fugue, for instance, on the violin.
yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
almost theoretical that you can actually play it and execute it. But I'm sure you can, you've probably seen this in your students. Sometimes it's, I don't know, do you ever tell them, wow, no one's going to want to play that? It's just kind of unplayable.
It's it's a question of what is the music doing, not so much whether it's fitting the instrument or not. Well, I do have one example of a guy who wrote a fantastic, he was a computer genius. He wrote this piece on the computer for piano. And it was really interesting piece, but it was not a piano piece. It was unplayable. And I told him, and he said, "Well, I want this piece played." And I said, "Well, right now, you're not going to get anybody to play this piece." I said, "Well," he said, "Well, what do I have to change?" I said, "Well, you got to put the hands together for one thing. They were doing like six different rhythms about a mile apart, and that's one. Number two, you have to know what your rhythms are." He had no idea how complicated these rhythms were, and I said, "If you can play these rhythms for me and clap them out slowly and put the hands together, we'll think about it being played."
Hmm.
He was so determined, this kid. He did just that, and he played every rhythm for me slowly, and he got the hands together, and we handed it to one of our teachers at Bard, and I said it was still very difficult. He said, I can do this. I might have to fake some of it, but I can do it." Yeah.
But it's really interesting what you're saying. So you changed these things, but essentially it was the same piece. When you talk about the music, you've used that term a few times. You're more concerned with the music than how it lies, on the instrument. It's still, even though hands together, for example, it still had essentially the same power.
You mean the piece of the students, you mean?
Yes, of the student, right?
Well, he lost some of the individuality because he was writing an electronic piece, basically, not a piano piece.
Hmm.
So that's a different ball game, I think. But if a player says to me, "This double stop is unplayable," I'll say, "Well, let's fix it."
Hmm.
But if they say to me, "This passage is incredibly difficult at this dynamic in this register," I'll think about that because it depends on what they're willing to go for, what I'm willing to give up, you know?
I'll show you one of those in your piece later.
Oh, okay. Okay, okay.
Well, so then tell us. I mean, you've written at least a couple of solo clarinet. Have you written a newer
I've
solo
written one
clarinet?
solo clarinet piece, which is played a lot. And I have a solo, oh, I have six clarinet pieces, one for piano, clarinet and piano, one for quintet with string quartet, one in a trio, violin, clarinet, and piano, and another one with an ensemble, and a clarinet concerto.
Hmm.
I love the clarinet. It's a fantastically flexible and powerful instrument. It can do anything. It's just an amazing instrument.
What does so for our audience, if you could, what does that mean? It can do anything. It sounds like by implication you're saying as opposed to some other instruments.
Yeah, it can play fast. It can play long held singing lines. It can play extremely softly, and it can play very loudly. And it can punch. It can punch. It can jump too. It just has an amazing flexibility.
Hmm. Actually, one of your clarinet and piano work was premiered by my wife and co-artistic director
Oh, that's right.
for
That's right.
HM.
Oh, she worked
Uh,
with Anthony on
that's
that.
right,
Yes, that's
with
right.
Anthony
Yeah,
McGill.
yeah.
It's
That's
just in the
right.
last couple of years, I think. So,
That's right.
by the way, let me just interrupt our talk just for a second. I didn't mention to our audience. Please feel free to ask questions. You can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and along the way, and certainly at the end, we'll get to some of your questions. Um, so tell us a little bit about Wings. We'll listen to.
Okay.
I know you hate this, but a little bit
Well,
excerpt.
you're going to start at the beginning, right?
Yes, we'll start at the
I don't
beginning.
care if you do anything but start at the beginning.
It'll be horrible to cut off, but
Well, this is I wrote for Laura Flax, who was a wonderful clarinetist in my group in the Da Capo Players. I wrote a piece for each one member of the group actually, and uh, it, this has a funny story. I she had a very panther-like, seamless, the way clarinetists can swim around notes really like silk. Um, so I wrote this piece with that in mind. And I called her up and I said, I have a title for this piece. And she said, yeah, she was in San Francisco with the orchestra there. I said, Panthers. And there was this silence on the other end of the phone. Fine, Joan, this is your piece. Whatever you want to call it Panthers. She was not exactly enthralled by that title. So then the piece started to take off and started to go up and really take off. And I said, I can't. Panthers is no longer applicable here. I got to find a big bird. I found a big bird. I called her back up. I'm sorry, the piece took off. So it's now called Falcons. Silence. Fine, Joan, it's your piece. Whatever you want. She definitely wasn't excited about that title. So that was really a dumb title. So I turned it into Wings. And now I think that's actually one of my best titles because it implies flying of some kind. And that's what this piece is. It's a good image. It's a very good image of a big bird up flying way up high and then diving down to get the fish down below. So anyways, that's my story about Wings, and that's a good image for what you're going to hear. But in this piece, I want to say one thing. I did start experimenting with slow time, which I got from Messin actually. How to make really slow time work.
we're going to listen to some of String Force,
Okay,
which
okay.
is was it your first solo piece for violin? Was String Force
No,
your
I
first?
wrote a piece before that called
Oh, that's right, Platinum Spirals,
Platinum Spirals.
which
Thank you.
you forbade me to play one time, and I want to talk about that. One,
Oh, okay.
I think I asked you about playing it, and you said, "Oh no, play String Force or String Force." You know, so
Somebody suggested that I sign out and then
yes,
come back in.
yeah. Why didn't you
I'm going
do
to try
that?
that.
Why
Okay, shall
didn't
I
you
do
do that?
that?
Yeah, while we
Okay,
listen to String Force.
okay.
Hello, we're back. I don't know if Joan is back, but we're trying to restart her computer. That was an amazing performance by the violinist Jinju Cho, I believe from the Cleveland Institute of Music, and that was called String Force 1. And here's Joan coming on. I'm going to demonstrate a few things from a piece she called Second String Force. And Joan she's very modest. She'll say, well, I don't write for the individual instrument. Joan, welcome back. Can you hear us?
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Yeah?
I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Okay.
Hello.
So while we'll still try to figure out Joan's audio, I was going to say whether Joan will kind of admit it to herself or not, she's just a natural at writing idiomatically for each individual instrument. Having said that, as she was discussing earlier, she's not concerned with making it easy for the violin. So there are some very unforgiving things that she uses in her violin writing. But here are some examples of writing that is just both very flattering on the violin. It might be difficult, but it's not awkward. There's actually quite a difference for us. And when it's difficult, but feels good to play, it gives us a lot of motivation to keep working on it. So here's an example of a passage in which she uses very arpeggiated writing, fast notes that go up and down the instrument very rapidly. Playing it in slow motion for you once so that you can see what's happening as it goes by quickly. And you can, you probably noticed in already the string force, a trademark of Joan's is simply how fast and brilliant her music can be. And that's why, as she said, she loves the clarinet, can play very fast, and the violin too. And so she exploits that. Here's another example of something that is very natural to do on the violin, makes it sound very brilliant, which are trills, trilling notes very rapidly. And here she combines that with very rapid register changes. And then this is an example of the kind of writing that is a little bit more instrumentally anonymous for Joan. You will hear this in her clarinet writing, you will hear it in her ensemble writing, in her piano writing, which are these very, very rapid chromatic figures. And that final figure is, again, is another thing that is very idiomatic to the violin. You can't imagine that figure being played, as she said earlier, on the trumpet, or even with their great ranges on the cello or on the clarinet. This is a very special, individual, kind of magical writing that happens at the top of the instrument. A composer like Niccolo Paganini, the great violin virtuoso, and arguably the greatest writer of music on the violin, not surprising because he knew the violin better than anybody, would use this kind of ghostly writing, sometimes in conjunction with a melody. I wish Joan were here to hear us hear my example of a place she was talking about, where a performer might say to her, "This is Joan. This is very awkward and very difficult, but possible." And I wouldn't be surprised if one violinist or another hasn't talked to her about this particular passage. Very high, magical, theoretically a magical sound on the violin. She mentioned walking on eggshells when she's playing Mozart. Is very, very uncomfortable to play. But theoretically, a really magical, eerie sound. And that is a perfect example of the kind of sound that performers, really sensitive performers who can really recognize the power in the music, are willing to put in all the time to try to make that, to pull off that effect. And then finally, when you're writing for a solo instrument, the problem often is that we don't have the idea of melody and accompaniment, or we don't have as much a sense of harmony. Joan was accomplishing this by some of these rapid arpeggios. Hello, Joan. Are your ears burning? Can you hear us? Okay, maybe not yet. Can you hear us, Joan?
Am I here?
Can you hear?
I have no idea what's going on.
Oh no, you don't hear us at all?
Now I hear you. I hear
Oh,
you. Everything's.
wonderful. Well,
I'm.
we've been talking about you for a while, and I've
Oh,
been playing some things from
oh, you
second.
poor thing.
No, I've been talking about some things from second string force.
Oh,
Some
okay. Oh,
some just
thank.
some techniques. Just kind of walking our audience through some of the nitty gritty things that you use, to create
Okay.
this
Thank you for
sound.
covering for me.
And we were able to listen to all of Jinju's performance as well, so it was actually really nice.
Oh, good. Oh,
But
good. That's good.
this is the last kind of amazing violin-y effect that you use in this. Now, Joan, you were saying earlier that you don't write. You're not really considering the violin so much, all the little details, but are you aware, for instance, in this kind of writing, that we have an open A string that we're going to potentially use? Okay, so that was very intentional, right?
Yes and no. See, I think some people say, well, you should read violin technique books, orchestration books. No, I don't think so because no matter, you can jump from here, but maybe you can't jump because the double stop is too close or it's too wide or something. There's not anything that you can really try out. I wrote a violin concerto, and it was a very difficult piece, and I was sure that it was going to be impossible to play because I'm not a violinist, I'm a pianist. But I just did the best I could, and there was only one double stop that I was way up high that just was very hard to sound. I was so surprised that I managed to pull that off. And I think it's because I've been around the violin a long time. I think there's a lot of information that I have that's unconscious about the strings and winds now too. Less brass. I'm not as comfortable with brass, but
Mhm.
I think there's a lot that we internalize that's not necessarily known um, intellectually. You know what I mean?
Hmm. No, that's exactly what I was telling our listeners, that there's just something very intuitive about how you
There
write,
is,
at
yeah,
least
very.
for the violin, and I'm sure for many other instruments as well.
I
Um,
think composers write the music first, and then they think about the instrument second, because Beethoven wrote some really awful, awkward stuff for voice, for example, the Ninth Symphony. But they play it, they sing it all the time. Why? Because it's just very good music. The fact that it's awkward is less important than the fact that it really works so well. No,
I just want to
and that's true
remind
of a lot of things, a lot of music actually.
I just want to remind our viewers that you're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We had This was interesting. Earlier, we had a couple of people ask nearly simultaneously, "Have you written for saxophone?"
I have. I had this piece, Wings, was transcribed for saxophone by three saxophonists, and that was played a lot. And I got to hear the saxophone a lot through that piece, and got to know it. And somebody came along and wanted an original saxophone piece. So by that time, I was sort of felt prepared. So I wrote a piece that 50 saxophonists played to start out with. That was your colleague at NEC, Ravnowski.
Oh yeah,
He
Ken.
does these consortiums of saxophonists. So it went out immediately to 50 saxophonists, and it was really fun to write. That's another great instrument, saxophone.
I mean, would you say it's there are a lot of similarities in timbre and register to clarinet? I guess it depends which saxophone, of course.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, but they're very different. And when they play wings on the saxophone, it's very different from the clarinet because there's a power in the saxophone that is unbelievable. I mean, they can really belt it out. And they can also run around very fast. And they can play softly, but not as soft as the clarinet and not as smooth as the clarinet. So they have pros and cons,
Hmm.
the two of
So
them.
I mean, so right just now, it sounds like you enjoy both versions of
Yeah, they're
Wings.
very different, but I enjoy both. But I have a new piece called Second Flight, which is for originally for saxophone.
Well, how can you imagine string force on the cello?
Could work. I think it could work. It would be quite different, but it could work. We were talking about this before, you and I. Bach, you can take Bach everywhere. He can be played on the guitar, on the voice, on the organ, on whatever, and it works on any of those instruments. But Chopin, you cannot take his music away from the piano. You can't. It does not go well on any other instrument. So to me as a composer, it's interesting to see how composers' DNAs come out of an instrument or not.
Hmm. Hmm.
No,
We have a question. What music do you listen to while you're in the midst of composing?
I listen to very little music because I'm so busy making it. I don't have. I want to get away from it and watch a film or something. I spend a lot of time making music. So the only time I listen is when I have to my students or when there's a concert or I'm judging something. And judging is actually a good way to listen to music in a group. kind of over a period of days. That's a great way because
Mhm.
that's what you're there for.
I'm really, I'd love, I think it would be really fascinating for everyone to hear, because and for me as well. We just started to touch upon this. Um, we've talked about, a couple of your pieces from your past that you're less crazy about. Actually, even in talking about what music to present tonight, um, Joan vetoed me in one of my choices, a piece that I really like.
Oh, I'm
And
sorry. I'm
no, and
sorry.
it's
I
so
shouldn't
that
do
it
that.
was,
I should not do that.
but it
But
was fascinating to hear you, the composer, say, "Oh no, don't do that piece," and so. But what is it? What is it about some pieces that you don't want to hear much anymore, and other pieces that I know you feel very close to?
well, my music's like my children, and it's divided into three very clear categories. I have my boring children that never really get off the ground, and then I have my delinquents who perform really well at certain times and really badly at other times. And then I have my stars that perform 80, 90% of the time pretty well, pretty strongly. And I'm pretty, you have to be honest with yourself as a composer, otherwise, you can't grow. You have to really face the music, and say, okay, this is not working because. And then when you have a lot of music, which I have over the last 60 years, these children perform sometimes a lot, are performed a lot. Others are hardly touched. Others are played now and then. And it's it pretty much matches up my perception of them, pretty
So,
much.
so are there there are none of those works that you don't enjoy hearing as much that have actually become very popular?
Well, it's sometimes it depends on the culture, the instrumental culture, because some cultures, instrumental cultures, are very welcoming to composers, living composers, and others are not. The flute world is probably the most welcoming, and the percussion world. They invite composers and they commission composers up the wazoo, and they're just constantly creating new music. Um, some other worlds are not so welcoming, especially the ones with large repertoires. Sorry.
Yeah, but here
And
you
you,
are. But here you are, Joan. You have two amazing contributions to the violin repertoire, which the solo violin repertoire. But it's actually surprisingly, compared to some other instruments, we do have a lot of good older stuff, but it's still relatively small, and it because as I said, the challenges of writing for the solo violin was something. Beethoven didn't do anything. Brahms didn't do anything. Tchaikovsky didn't do anything.
but I
For
don't think they did any solos of any
Well,
kind.
solo piano. That is solo
Well, but
piano.
that's not that's an orchestral instrument. That yeah, no.
Right, but this speaks
So
to
that's
the
why Bach suddenly got elevated up to here, right?
well, and but I mean, this speaks again to the theme of tonight, which is how different it is just to compose for one lonely voice. And I mean, your two works are definitely already part of the canon,
Well,
in a
thank
good way.
you, because that tough canon, the violin, that's a tough world, the violin world. It really is. When Bella Hertzova, I wrote second string fourths for her, and she premiered it at her recital in New York at one of the Young Concert Artists Guild concerts, and it was like she opened with three solos: Bach, Izai, and me. And I called her up and I said, please don't do this to me. I would really appreciate it if you didn't do it in that order. Because these are the iconic pieces of the violin world, and they're very strong pieces. And I said, please don't put me at the end there. Please, I beg you, put me first or put me in the next half or something. Get me away from those guys. She said, no, I'm going to leave you right where you are. and, and the thing is, it worked much to my amazement. It worked because my piece was so different from the other two. And she played it so beautifully. Oh my God. Uh, I was so I was so stunned that I could survive that. I really was.
Oh,
I,
it really peace brings the house down. I
well,
got to play it.
you played it beautifully
I
at
got to play it.
NEC. Yes, you
Yeah.
did.
And I will really actually it's a very special performance to me. In addition to just having you there, it was an 80th birthday celebration for you, and
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
but
But you
I
also were
learned
having
it.
a baby.
I learned it in the hospital.
His wife was having a baby at that point, that day, right?
It was no February. So he was born on February 7th. This was 3 years ago, and the concert was on Valentine's Day. It was on February 14th.
But you
So
had to learn the piece.
I had my violin at the hospital, and I don't know if it's the first time they've ever had a violinist practicing hours. Um,
That's a great story. That's a great story. I was amazed that you went through with it at all. Yeah,
oh
yeah,
well,
yeah.
Joan, I'm so sorry that you had the stress of the technical issues, but this
I
has
am
been
too. I am. I apologize. I don't know what happened. I apologize to the audience.
no
I
worries. We had a really wonderful conversation.
thank you for your
I'm sure
patience,
everybody
Zubin.
enjoyed it. And please listen. We're after we sign out, after we say goodbye, we're going to play the last few minutes. If you'd like to listen, this also, Joan cringed when she heard, "Oh, it's the last few minutes," but you start pieces well, and your endings are amazing. Maybe even better for me. So,
This
so
was a
last
fantastic performance, right? The one you're playing from Lake Champlain.
right.
That
Yeah.
was an amazing performance,
Yeah,
really.
so it's her piece from rather recent piece, 2014, I believe, maybe something like that. White Granite. It's a piano quartet, and very exciting piece.
2010.
2010.
Yeah.
Um, so I'll just remind everybody who's watching that the premiere of our next performance is this coming Saturday evening. Cellist Elisa Weilerstein and pianist Inon Barnatan, two dear friends of ours. Inon visited the festival a few years ago last, and Elisa hopefully will be visiting imminently live. We'll be able to meet her. And thank you, Joan, for listening and for
Thank,
joining us.
thank you.
And we hope to see you in person as
Thank
well.
you. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you,
Have a good
everybody.
night.
Bye bye. Bye bye.